Hi Scott, how are you?
I'm very well, Eileen.
Good. I've got a farmer who's had a BVD problem in the past, and they will have new replacement calves coming up this season. So we were discussing as to how best to make sure there aren't any PIs in that new crop of replacement calves.
Yeah, so obviously the sooner we test them, the better. If we leave a persistently infected BVD calf in with that group, obviously they're virus factories and they're putting virus all over the place. So while you can't create another PI within those young calves, because they're not pregnant, you certainly can get disease and stunt growth, which in and of itself is a problem, and because BVD is an immunosuppressant, they're just more susceptible to other diseases as well. But of course, the greater worry is if that animal survives through until breeding time and she then passes the virus to a pregnant animal, you create the next generation of PIs as well as getting all the abortions. So that's a long-winded way of saying the earlier we know about those PIs, the better.
So traditionally there's been concerns that the test at an early age isn't reliable, but you've recently done some work to show that we've got much better tools now.
Yeah, so the kind of early research showed, and particularly when using blood tests, that the maternal antibodies, so the antibodies that are passed from the colostrum from the cow to the calf, if that cow had seen BVD or been vaccinated with BVD, then the antibodies against BVD would be passed through the colostrum to the calf. So when you bled the calf, particularly, it would interfere with the test. So there were some concerns historically about false negatives. So what I mean by that is an animal that was truly persistently infected with BVD would come up negative on the blood test in the laboratories, and people would think, oh, she's fine, and keep that animal, which would then subsequently be found to be a PI. Now, what then evolved was the idea of using the ear notches, and the really good thing about the ear notches is that the antibodies in the bloodstream don't interfere quite as much with the ear notches. So the more recent work that we've done was to actually go out and ear notch over 1,000 calves in farms where we knew there'd been PI cows in the preceding breeding season. So the idea was that we were concerned that there were going to be PI calves born in the subsequent calving period. So we went in and looked at those, and what we found was in those 11 farms, 4 of the farms actually did have PI calves, so we genuinely had problem calves. But the more important finding was that we ear notched those animals on 4 occasions. So, within the first week of life, in the second week of life, the 4th week, and the 6th week of life. And what we showed was that it didn't matter when we did the ear notches, we found the persistently infected animals. So the really important finding here is that it doesn't appear to matter what age we test these calves for BVD if we use the ear notch. The problem still applies with blood tests. We wouldn't blood test the very young calves, but the ear notch seems to be working fine. Yeah. The other thing we found, which was quite interesting, and as you might expect, if you've got a PI calf, you've got an animal that's excreting virus, then other calves in that group were test positive. So we actually found virus in the other calves, but of course the virus goes away if you retest them. So one of the important messages in here is, if you use the PCR test, it is too sensitive and it'll pick it up. If you use the ELISA, it will effectively only pick up the PI animals. So with the ear notches, it's better, in fact, to use the ELISA than the PCR test.
That's the antigen ELISA.
The antigen ELISA, yeah, that's right.
Antibodies that the animal builds to fight the infection.
Correct, yes. So that's a very good point, that there are different tests. Yeah. So, as you say, the antibody test, so that's the body developing immunity to the ELISA, can be tested. We've got those tests, and in fact, that's the test that's used in milk sometimes. But what I'm talking about is the antigen ELISA, so actually looking for the virus, in this case, in the ear notch.
Wonderful. So if I go and disbud calves at a fortnight of age, I can ear notch at the same time and have a reliable result. And if we get positive animals, then the advice is to wait a month and retest. Is that
if you're
advice?
using the PCR test? So I mean,
Yes.
that's obviously it's a discussion that the vet needs to have with the farmer,
Yeah.
and different labs are doing different tests, so it gets a little bit complicated. But if we use the antigen and we get a single positive test, we can be
That's
pretty
positive.
confident
Yeah.
that that animal's going to be infected for life. That's a persistently infected animal. If we use the PCR test and we get a test positive, then yes, I would suggest that it would be worth retesting that animal, once she's more than 6 or 8 or 10 weeks of age. And just to put that in context, what we found was that 80% of the animals that would test positive on the PCR were actually transiently infected.
Right.
So only 1 in 5 of the animals that were tested on the PCR were truly persistently infected. And so the issue there is that you could actually cull those animals, but you'd be culling a lot of animals that were transiently infected. In fact, the virus would disappear with
Yes.
time. So it's really those persistently infected animals that we want to get rid of, and therefore the antigen ELISA in that ear notch is fine to pick those up.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Yep.